The Forgotten Savior. The wind howled through the ruins of an abandoned alien city, dust and ash swirling in the cold air. Captain Eric Vance moved carefully, his rifle steady in his hands. His mission was simple: recover lost human data from this war-torn planet and leave before the enemy found him. But something felt wrong. The silence was too deep, the shadows too still. Then, a whisper broke the silence. "Is it really you?" Eric spun around, his heart pounding. The voice was soft, almost disbelieving. It came from the darkness between two crumbling buildings. He aimed his weapon, stepping forward cautiously. A figure emerged, a tall, hooded alien, her glowing blue eyes filled with something he couldn't understand. She didn't seem like a threat, but Eric didn't lower his weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded. The alien hesitated, then pulled back her hood. Beneath it was a face both familiar and strange. Sharp features, silver markings running down her cheeks, and long dark hair braided in a way that stirred a distant memory. Then she said something that made his breath catch. "You saved me, years ago. You don't remember." Eric's grip on his rifle tightened. He had fought in many battles, saved many lives. But this, he didn't recall. "I don't know you," he said, trying to sound firm. But deep inside, something in his mind stirred. The alien woman stepped closer, her expression a mix of sadness and hope. "My name is Jaira. I was just a child when you found me, when you pulled me from the ruins of my home. You told me to run, to live. You gave me a chance when no one else did." Eric frowned. He had rescued people before, but memories of the past war were blurred, lost in the chaos of survival. He studied her, trying to place the moment. And then, like a forgotten dream, it returned. A burning city. A young, terrified alien girl hiding beneath rubble as soldiers advanced. Eric, against orders, had lifted her up and told her to run before the bombs fell. But that girl couldn't have survived, could she? He stared at Jaira in disbelief. That was a long time ago. For you, maybe, but for me, I never forgot. Before Eric could respond, his wrist communicator beeped. Incoming threat detected. He turned, scanning the area. His ship was a kilometer away, but something was approaching fast. "We need to move," he said. Jaira didn't argue. She pulled out a sleek alien blade and nodded. "They are coming for me." Eric led the way, but questions burned in his mind. Who was chasing her? Why now? As they ran through the ruins, the ground suddenly shook with a violent explosion. Behind them, a massive ship descended, its engines roaring like a beast from the depths. The enemy had arrived. Eric ducked behind a broken wall, gripping his weapon. "What the hell is going on?" Jaira's voice was steady but urgent. "They know I found you, and they will do anything to stop us from talking." Eric's gut tightened. He didn't know the full story yet, but one thing was clear. Whoever was after Jaira was powerful, and now they wanted him dead too. The soldier and the alien girl he once saved were now trapped together, and the only way out was to fight. Secrets of the past. The night sky above the ruined city was filled with smoke and fire as Eric and Jaira sprinted through the rubble. Behind them, the enemy ship hovered like a predator, its searchlights sweeping the ground. Eric's grip tightened around his rifle. His instincts screamed danger, but his mind was still trying to process what was happening. Jaira, the alien girl he had saved years ago, now fully grown, standing before him, telling him that his past actions had put them both in danger. He had spent his whole life thinking he had left that war behind. But the war had never left him. They ducked into a crumbling structure, breathing hard. Eric turned to Jaira, demanding answers. "Who the hell is after you?" Jaira's glowing blue eyes locked onto his. "Not just me. You too." Outside, the ship's engines rumbled as figures in dark armor descended. Eric's military-trained eyes immediately recognized them. Mercenaries. Not standard troops, not from any official military. That meant someone was paying them. Someone powerful. Jaira pressed a small device on her wrist, and a holographic map flickered to life in the air. It showed 2 signals moving toward them. "They're cutting us off," she said. Eric gritted his teeth. "Then we need to move. Now." They slipped through the ruined streets, moving like ghosts in the dark. Eric's instincts kicked in, scanning for cover, checking for weak spots in the enemy's formation. But he couldn't shake the unease growing in his gut. Who was she running from? And why was he a target now? Jaira led them to a collapsed building, where a hidden passage led underground. They descended into the dark, where flickering emergency lights barely illuminated the old tunnels. Finally, Eric had enough. He grabbed her wrist, forcing her to stop. "Talk." She hesitated, her expression conflicted. But then she sighed and pulled something from the inside of her cloak, a small metallic cube. Eric frowned. "What is that?" Jaira's voice was almost a whisper. "You gave this to me." Eric stared at it. "I've never seen that before." Jaira shook her head. "Not directly. But when you saved me, this was in your possession. You dropped it. I kept it safe all these years." The cube pulsed with a dim, golden light. It looked ancient, and yet strangely familiar. "This is why they are after me. After us." Eric didn't understand. "What does it do?" Jaira took a slow breath. "It holds the last message of my people. The truth about what happened to them." A cold realization settled in Eric's chest. He had always believed the war was a result of human expansion, alien retaliation, political greed. But this was something else. Jaira pressed a sequence on the cube, and the device came to life. A hologram emerged, grainy, flickering, but unmistakable. It was a recording of a massacre. A fleet of ships, human ships, attacking Solari cities. Bombs dropping, fires raging, innocent civilians fleeing. And in the center of the chaos, a young girl hiding in the rubble. Eric's stomach twisted. He knew that image. It was her, the moment before he had found her, before he had pulled her from the ruins and told her to run. The hologram flickered again, shifting to a recorded transmission. A human officer's voice, cold and emotionless. "Initiate Phase 1. Blame the Solari. Wipe out the survivors." Eric froze. His own people had started the war. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, it had all been a lie. His pulse pounded in his ears. This can't be real. Jaira looked at him with sad eyes. "It is. And now that I have found you, they will come for us both." Before Eric could respond, a distant explosion rocked the tunnel. The mercenaries had found them. Jaira grabbed his arm. "We have to go. If they take this device, everything will be lost." Eric clenched his jaw. His past was no longer just a memory. It was hunting him. And this time, there was no running. The hunt begins. The explosion rattled the underground tunnel, sending dust and debris raining down on Eric and Jaira. The mercenaries had found them. Eric swore under his breath. His rifle was already in his hands, instincts taking over. There was no time to think, only time to act. Jaira gripped the mysterious cube tightly against her chest, her breathing uneven. "They're coming." Eric glanced at her. No kidding. He pressed his back against the rough tunnel wall, listening. Footsteps. Multiple. Heavy boots striking against the ground. The mercenaries weren't just storming in blind. They were moving in formation, highly trained, well-equipped, and ready to kill. Eric pulled a small device from his belt and pressed a button. The scanner flickered to life, revealing 4 enemies closing in from the main passage behind them. More were likely stationed at the exits. They were trapped. Jaira whispered urgently, "We can't let them get the cube." Eric exhaled sharply, nodding. He didn't fully understand what was in that thing yet, but one thing was clear. Whoever was after it was willing to kill for it. And that meant he couldn't let them have it. The ambush. A metallic clinking sound echoed down the tunnel. Eric's eyes widened. Grenade. Move. He grabbed Jaira and dove to the side as the explosion ripped through the passage, heat and shrapnel slicing through the air. His ears rang, but he forced himself up, blinking through the dust. A dark figure emerged through the smoke, rifle raised. Eric moved faster. With a swift motion, he grabbed the mercenary's weapon, twisted it aside, and drove an elbow into the man's throat. The mercenary choked, staggering backward. Before he could recover, Eric yanked the knife from his own belt and drove it into the man's chest. The mercenary collapsed. One down, three more. Jaira had ducked behind cover, gripping her blade. Eric turned his head just in time to see another enemy charging in. A single shot rang out. Jaira's energy pistol fired, striking the enemy directly in the chest. The mercenary fell instantly, armor sizzling from the impact. Eric raised an eyebrow. Nice shot. She barely reacted, her focus razor-sharp. More coming. They didn't have time to fight them all. Eric quickly analyzed the tunnel structure. There had to be another way out. His gaze landed on a rusted maintenance shaft near the ceiling. It was small, barely big enough to fit one person at a time. Up there, he pointed. Jaira's eyes widened. That leads outside. It's better than staying here. More footsteps thundered toward them. No time to hesitate. Eric crouched down, boosting Jaira up as she grabbed the edge of the shaft. She pulled herself inside, moving quickly. The moment she disappeared into the dark, Eric turned to cover their escape. Three more mercenaries charged in. Eric fired, his shot striking two before they could react. The last one returned fire, forcing Eric to duck behind cover. His rifle's ammo count blinked, nearly empty. Not good. The mercenary moved fast, vaulting over debris, closing the distance between them. Eric barely had time to raise his weapon before the enemy was on him, slamming into him with brute force. They crashed against the tunnel wall, struggling for control. The mercenary was stronger, his mechanical arm tightening around Eric's throat. Eric's vision blurred. His grip weakened. Then, out of nowhere, a blade flashed. The mercenary gasped, his body tensing. A moment later, he collapsed, revealing Jaira standing behind him, breathing hard, her blade dripping with dark liquid. She had come back for him. Eric coughed, rubbing his throat. You could have left me. Jaira gave him a sharp look. I owe you my life. Twice now. He exhaled, pushing himself up. Let's get the hell out of here. Escaping the trap. They climbed into the maintenance shaft, crawling through the tight space. The metal groaned under their weight, rust and grime covering their hands. Minutes passed in silence, except for their labored breathing. Finally, they reached an opening, a vent leading to the surface. Eric forced it open, pulling himself out first. They were outside. The night sky stretched above them, endless and cold. In the distance, the mercenary ship loomed, but the immediate area was clear. For now, Jaira climbed out beside him, clutching the cube tightly. We need to leave the planet. Eric glanced at her. That's not going to be easy. She shook her head. I know someone who can help, but we have to reach them first. He sighed. Let me guess. Dangerous, unpredictable, and probably doesn't like humans. Jaira's lips twitched into a slight smirk. Something like that. Eric checked his gear. His rifle was nearly empty, and his body ached from the fight. But they had no choice. This wasn't over. If what Jaira said was true, if that cube really held proof that the war had been started by humans, then Eric had just become a fugitive from his own people. And that meant they were hunting him now, too. The war for loyalty. The cold wind howled as Eric and Jaira moved through the barren wastelands, far from the ruined city where the mercenaries had ambushed them. The terrain was rough. Jagged cliffs and deep ravines carved the landscape, remnants of the war that had nearly destroyed this planet. Eric's muscles ached from the fight, and his rifle was nearly useless with only a few shots left. The only thing keeping him moving was the weight of what he had just learned. His own people had started the war. For years, he had believed the Xelari were the aggressors. Now, with Jaira's evidence, the cube containing the last recorded message of her people, he knew the truth. And truth was dangerous. How much farther? Eric asked, adjusting his gear. Jaira, walking slightly ahead, pointed toward the horizon. There, the Tauran Rebellion's outpost. Eric narrowed his eyes. A rebellion. They're the only ones who might help us. That didn't make Eric feel any better. Rebels were unpredictable, desperate. Some were freedom fighters. Others were just as corrupt as the governments they opposed. But they had no other choice. The mercenaries hunting them weren't ordinary bounty hunters. They were being paid by someone powerful, someone who wanted the truth buried. And Eric had a feeling he knew exactly who that was. The betrayal. As they neared the outpost, Eric scanned the area. The structure was hidden beneath the rocky cliffs, with only a few visible entrances. Armed sentries patrolled the perimeter, their weapons sleek and advanced. Jaira walked forward confidently. "Stay close." A voice rang out from above. "Stop right there." A heavily armored soldier stepped out from the shadows, his weapon trained on them. His armor bore the red insignia of the Tauran Rebellion, a stylized claw. Jaira raised her hand slightly, showing she wasn't a threat. "We need to see Kiran." The soldier's helmet tilted slightly. "Who's the human?" "A friend." There was a long pause. Then the soldier lowered his weapon and spoke into his communicator. A moment later, a hidden door in the rock wall slid open, revealing a passage. "Follow me." Inside, the outpost was a maze of tunnels carved from rock, illuminated by dim blue lights. The air was thick with tension. Soldiers eyed Eric as he walked past, some whispering among themselves. They didn't trust him. Finally, they were led into a large chamber where a tall Xelari male sat on a throne-like chair made of salvaged metal. His deep violet eyes flickered as he studied them. "Kiran, leader of the Tauran Rebellion." Jaira stepped forward. "We need your help." Kiran leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And why would I help you, Princess?" Eric stiffened. "Princess." He turned to Jaira in shock. She never told him she was royalty. Jaira met Kiran's gaze without hesitation. "Because we have proof. Proof that the war was a lie. That my people were slaughtered not because of war, but because of human orders." Kiran's eyes darkened. "You're saying what we fought for was built on deception." She pulled out the cube and activated it. The hologram flickered to life, showing once again the brutal footage of human forces destroying Xelari cities and an officer's voice ordering the attack. The entire room went silent. For a long moment, Kiran said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply. "You should not have come here." Jaira's breath caught. "What?" Kiran stood, pacing slowly. "You think I didn't already know?" Eric's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Kiran turned, his violet eyes cold. "I made my peace with that truth long ago. We fight not for justice, but for survival." Eric's blood ran cold as armed soldiers stepped forward, weapons raised. You're working with them," Jaira whispered, realization dawning. Kiran smirked. "Not them, but the highest bidder. Betrayal." He had already sold them out. The escape. Alarms blared through the outpost as more rebel forces arrived. Eric grabbed Jaira's arm. "We need to go. Now." She hesitated. "But." "Now." A gunshot rang out. Eric shoved Jaira down, barely dodging the energy blast that tore past them. The room erupted into chaos. Eric fired back, his last few bullets hitting their mark. Jaira pulled out her energy pistol, taking down another soldier. But there were too many. They sprinted through the tunnels as red lights flashed around them. Footsteps pounded behind them. Eric's mind raced. They needed a way out. Jaira pulled out a small device and threw it at the wall. A second later, an explosion ripped through the tunnel, collapsing part of it. That bought them time. They ran through a side passage, bursting through a hangar filled with stolen ships. Jaira didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward a sleek black vessel. Eric followed as blaster fire exploded around them. "You know how to fly this thing," Eric shouted as they scrambled inside. Jaira's hands flew over the controls. "Better than you do." The engines roared to life. Soldiers outside opened fire, but the ship's shields deflected the blasts. With a deafening roar, the ship shot into the sky. Eric collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, breathing hard. That could have gone better. Jaira's hands tightened on the controls. "We lost our only allies." Eric shook his head. "They were never our allies." She exhaled slowly. "So what now?" Eric looked out into space, his jaw set. "Now we find out who really started this war. The truth behind the lies." The stolen ship cut through the darkness of space, its engines humming softly as it drifted between the shattered remains of an old battlefield. Massive, lifeless warships floated silently, their metal husks scored by ancient weapons. This was the graveyard of the forgotten war, a place where both human and Xelari forces had once clashed, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and ghosts of the past. Inside the cockpit, Eric Vance sat in silence, his mind racing. Jaira sat beside him, her fingers flying over the ship's controls. She was scanning the wreckage for any active signals, looking for someone. "You still haven't told me who we're meeting," Eric finally spoke. Jaira's glowing blue eyes flickered toward him. "A man who knows the truth." Eric leaned back, arms crossed. "A man? That's not much to go on." She hesitated. "He was there, when it happened, when my world burned." Silence filled the space between them. Eric exhaled. They were getting deeper into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Whoever this man was, if he had survived the destruction of an entire species, he was either very lucky or very powerful. And either way, Eric wasn't sure he wanted to meet him. The secret survivor. Jaira guided the ship toward a massive derelict battleship, its hull covered in old battle scars. It was a human vessel, but its identification code had been wiped long ago. As they approached, a faint signal crackled over the comms. "You shouldn't have come." Jaira stiffened. "We don't have time for warnings. We need answers." Silence. Then, after a long pause, "Dock at Bay 4. The ship's hangar doors groaned open, revealing a dark, empty interior. Eric's gut told him this was a bad idea, but they had no other leads. They landed, weapons ready. As they stepped into the shadows of the dead ship, footsteps echoed in the silence. A figure emerged, a tall man, wrapped in a tattered black cloak, his face hidden behind an old military mask. But Eric recognized the insignia on his shoulder. Human High Command. This man had been a ranking officer. The war's true beginning. The man removed his mask, revealing a scared face, his eyes cold and tired. "Captain Eric Vance. I know who you are." His voice was rough, like gravel grinding against metal. Eric's jaw tightened. "Then you know why we're here." The man glanced at Jaira. "You're just like your father." Jaira inhaled sharply. "You knew him." The man nodded slowly. "I served with him, before everything fell apart." Eric took a step forward. "We need to know the truth. Who gave the order to start the war?" The old soldier exhaled and turned toward a console. He tapped a few buttons, and a holographic projection flickered to life. It displayed an old military briefing, marked classified. Eric's breath caught in his chest. The hologram played an image of a high-ranking human admiral sitting at a war table. Eric recognized him. Admiral Devran, one of the most powerful figures in human history. The admiral spoke, his voice eerily calm. "The Xelari have resources we need, resources we cannot afford to negotiate for. We will provoke them into attacking first, and then we will ensure their extinction." Silence. Jaira's fists clenched. Eric felt his own rage building in his chest. They had planned it. The entire war had been a setup. The old soldier turned to them. "Your people never had a chance, Jaira. This wasn't a war. It was extermination. Hunted once more." Eric ran a hand over his face. "And now we have the proof." Jaira's voice was cold. "Then we expose them." The old soldier let out a bitter laugh. "You think the galaxy will care? The people responsible are still in power. You'll be dead before you reach the first broadcast station." Before Eric could respond, the ship shook violently. The alarms blared. They had been found. Eric's communicator crackled to life with a cold, familiar voice. "Captain Vance, you should have stayed dead." "Admiral Devran." Jaira paled. "They tracked us. More ships were arriving. Fast." The old soldier cursed under his breath. "You need to leave. Now." Eric tightened his grip on his rifle. "What about you?" The soldier smiled grimly. "I was never leaving this ship alive." Before Eric could argue, the man pressed a button on his console. A moment later, the ship's self-destruct sequence activated. "Go." Eric grabbed Jaira's wrist, pulling her toward their ship as explosions rippled through the dying battleship. They barely made it into the cockpit as the hangar began collapsing. Jaira slammed the controls, and the engines roared to life. The ship shot out of the hangar just as the battleship behind them erupted into a massive fireball, debris scattering in all directions. But their escape was short-lived. An enemy fleet was waiting for them. "Brace yourself," Eric shouted as laser fire rained down on them. Jaira gritted her teeth, pulling the ship into evasive maneuvers. But no matter how fast they flew, no matter how well they dodged, they were completely surrounded. The war for loyalty. The stolen ship cut through the sky, its thrusters burning bright against the darkness of space. The planet below shrank into the distance, a graveyard of broken civilizations and buried truths. Eric's hands were tight around the ship's controls, his mind still racing from their narrow escape from the mercenaries. Jaira sat beside him, her glowing blue eyes scanning the screens. The cube she had carried for years, the proof of humanity's betrayal, rested in her hands. But now, they were alone. Their only lead, Kiran, the so-called leader of the Taran rebellion, had betrayed them. He had sold them out, proving that even those who claimed to fight for justice had their own price. Eric exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "We need a new plan." Jaira didn't look at him. "There's only one option left." Eric turned, waiting for her to continue. She finally spoke. "We take the fight to them. The enemy in the shadows." The ship's warning system suddenly beeped, pulling Eric's attention to the scanner. A ship was tailing them. Jaira's hands flew over the controls. No signatures. "It's running dark." Eric narrowed his eyes. Whoever was following them wasn't broadcasting identification codes, which meant one of two things. Either they were dealing with a rogue bounty hunter, or someone far worse. A voice crackled over the comms. It was distorted, robotic. "Captain Vance, you should have stayed dead." Eric stiffened. He knew that voice. Admiral Devran. The last command. Admiral Devran had once been one of the most powerful men in the human fleet, a war strategist, a man who had led countless invasions, a man Eric had once sworn to follow without question. Now he was the one hunting him. Jaira's eyes flicked to Eric, but he didn't react. Instead, he leaned forward and responded. "So you finally decided to finish what you started." A pause. Then, a low chuckle. "You don't understand, Captain. You were dead the moment you left that war zone years ago. You just didn't know it yet." The ship lurched violently as something locked onto them. A tractor beam. Jaira cursed under her breath. "They're pulling us in." Eric gritted his teeth. No escape. Not this time. "If we're captured, we die." Asterisk asterisk. Jaira whispered asterisk asterisk. Eric didn't disagree. But death wasn't the worst option. If the cube fell into enemy hands, the truth would die with them. A desperate gamble. Eric turned to Jaira. "How much do you trust me?" She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I'm about to do something really, really stupid." Without waiting for her response, Eric grabbed the ship's emergency override and slammed a sequence of buttons. The engine sputtered and died. Jaira's eyes widened. "You shut down the ship. Are you insane?" Eric gave her a tight grin. "Not insane. Just desperate. The enemy's trap." The ship was now a dead object, floating aimlessly toward the enemy vessel. On the scanner, Eric could see that Devran's ship was moving to intercept, likely sending a boarding team. Good. Jaira was gripping her blade now. This had better be a good plan. Eric pulled his rifle from its holster and checked the ammo. If it isn't, we won't live long enough to regret it. The ship shuddered as it was pulled into the docking bay of the enemy vessel. The second they landed, bright spotlights filled the cockpit. A mechanical voice rang out over the intercom. "Step out, hands in the air." Eric turned to Jaira. "Follow my lead." They walked down the ramp, into a room filled with heavily armed soldiers in black armor. Their weapons were already aimed. And standing at the front of them all was Admiral Devran. The truth is a weapon. The Admiral was older than Eric remembered, but his eyes were just as sharp. He wore a pristine uniform, his posture rigid. This wasn't a man who doubted his actions. This was a man who had already won. Devran stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "You never should have left that battlefield, Captain." Eric tilted his head. "And yet, here I am." Devran smirked, but not for long. He turned his gaze to Jaira. "And you, a princess without a kingdom. Did you really think this little rebellion of yours mattered?" Jaira's hands clenched, but Eric spoke first. "We have proof, Devran. We have the cube." The Admiral's smirk disappeared. His soldiers tensed. The room suddenly felt colder. Eric smiled grimly. "You weren't expecting that, were you?" For the first time, Devran hesitated, and Eric knew he had struck a nerve. The unseen battle. Devran exhaled, stepping back. "You think proof changes anything?" Eric didn't blink. "I think the right people seeing the truth changes everything." Devran studied him for a moment. Then he chuckled softly. "You really haven't learned, have you?" Before Eric could react, a sharp pain exploded in his side. A soldier had moved behind him, striking fast, a stun baton, right to his ribs. His vision blurred, and he dropped to one knee. Jaira moved to attack, but a dozen weapons were suddenly trained on her. Eric gritted his teeth as Devran crouched beside him. "You don't understand. The truth doesn't matter, Captain." He leaned in, voice low, "Because the people will believe what I tell them to believe." Eric's breathing was ragged. He looked up, meeting the Admiral's cold stare. "Then I guess it's a good thing I don't play by your rules." Because Eric had already sent the cube's data. To everyone. The final stand begins. The room's alarms suddenly blared. Devran's communicator crackled with frantic voices. "Sir, the data is spreading across the network. Silari systems, human communications. We can't stop it." Eric grinned through the pain. Devran's expression darkened. "Kill them both." The soldiers raised their weapons, and the ship rocked violently. The docking bay exploded, sending flames and debris everywhere. Through the chaos, Eric heard a voice over his communicator. "Hang tight, Captain. Reinforcements are here." The truth behind the lies. The world blurred around Eric as pain radiated from his ribs. His vision swam, his breath ragged as he knelt on the cold metallic floor of the enemy warship. The stun baton strike had been brutal, designed to hurt, not kill. Across from him, Jaira was still standing, her body tense, eyes burning with defiance as she glared at Admiral Devran. The older man was as cold as ever, his uniform crisp and spotless, His expression barely shifted as he spoke. You thought you could change anything by exposing the truth. Devran sighed, almost amused. You don't understand how the world works, Captain. The truth is a weapon, one we have already learned to control. Eric gritted his teeth. You're losing control right now, Admiral. A flicker of irritation passed over Devran's face. Eric had already sent the truth, the recordings of the war, the classified orders, everything, to countless human and Silari networks. The entire galaxy now knew. And Devran hated not being the one in charge of the story. The power of perception. The warship's comms flickered with urgent transmissions from military officials, government leaders, and news organizations. The truth was out, and the galaxy was demanding answers. Devran's soldiers shifted uneasily, their weapons still aimed at Eric and Jaira. But now, there was uncertainty in their eyes. They had followed orders believing they were fighting for justice. Now they were realizing they had been nothing more than pawns. Devran, ever the manipulator, saw the shift. He stepped forward, raising his voice. What have you really accomplished, Captain? He turned toward his own men. Even if the people know the truth, do you think they'll rise against us? They need order. They need strength. And when chaos comes, he let the words hang in the air, smirking. They will turn to us again. Jaira clenched her fists. You're wrong. Devran's smirk widened. Am I? A world on fire. The ship shuddered violently. An explosion rocked the hull, and the emergency sirens blared. One of Devran's officers ran into the room, eyes wide with panic. Sir, we're under attack. Devran's calm facade cracked. By who? The officer swallowed. Multiple factions, sir. The rebellion. Civilian fleets, even defectors from our own forces. They're calling for your surrender. Devran's face darkened. He turned back to Eric, his voice low and sharp. You think you've won. Eric forced himself to his feet, despite the pain in his side. I think the galaxy just decided for itself. Battle for the future. Chaos erupted. The docking bay doors exploded inward, and armed soldiers stormed in. Fighters from the Taran rebellion, rogue human forces, and Silari warriors. Eric's reinforcements had arrived. A gunfight broke out, plasma bolts tearing through the air. Devran's loyalists opened fire, but they were outnumbered and losing ground fast. Eric lunged forward, grabbing a fallen soldier's rifle. Jaira ducked beside him, already firing back at the enemy. The war had reached its tipping point. Devran cursed under his breath, pulling out his own weapon and retreating toward the bridge. His eyes met Eric's one last time. This isn't over. Then he was gone, hunting the Admiral. Eric turned to Jaira. We need to end this. Now. She nodded. He's heading for the command center. If he locks the ship down, we're trapped. They sprinted through the corridors, dodging debris and stray shots. The ship trembled from the damage being inflicted from outside. Eric could hear the distant voices over the comms, calls for surrender, others demanding Devran's arrest. The Admiral's empire was crumbling in real time. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Final confrontation. They burst into the command center, weapons raised, and found Devran standing at the main control panel, overriding the ship's systems. He looked up, calm as ever. You really are persistent. Eric leveled his rifle. Shut it down. Now. Devran smiled. No. He pressed a final command. The ship's auto-destruct sequence activated. Jaira's eyes widened. You're going to destroy everything. Devran tilted his head. If I can't control the future, no one will. The countdown started. 3 minutes. A captain's choice. Eric's mind raced. There was no time. If the ship exploded, thousands would die, including their allies outside. Jaira moved toward the control panel, trying to override it. I need time. Eric exhaled. They didn't have time. So he made a choice. Without hesitation, he rushed Devran. The Admiral fired, Eric dodged, the shot grazing his shoulder. But it didn't stop him. He tackled Devran, both men crashing to the floor. They struggled, fists colliding, years of war and betrayal coming to a final brutal end. Devran grabbed his sidearm, aiming it at Eric's head. Eric moved faster. He twisted the weapon out of Devran's grip, flipping the Admiral onto his back. And then, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. Devran's body jerked. His eyes widened in shock, then slowly dimmed. The warlord of deception was dead. A new beginning. Shira finally managed to shut down the self-destruct sequence. The alarms faded. The ship stabilized. Outside, the battle stopped. The remaining soldiers, those who had fought under Devran's rule, saw what had happened and lowered their weapons. It was over. Eric stood over the fallen admiral, his breath slow and steady. Shira stepped beside him, watching as the screens filled with transmissions from across the galaxy. The people had seen the truth, and they had chosen to fight back. The price of victory. Hours later, Eric and Shira stood on the bridge, looking down at the planet below. The war wasn't completely over. There would still be battles to fight. But the tide had turned. Shira exhaled, looking up at him. What happens now? Eric thought for a long moment. Then, finally, he answered, "We rebuild." He turned toward the endless stars, knowing that for the first time in years, he was fighting for the right side. The final stand. The wreckage of Devran's fleet floated in the dark abyss of space, silent testaments to a war that had finally tipped in favor of the truth. The battle was over. The people had risen. The rebellion had won. But Eric Vance wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Inside the newly claimed warship, he stood on the bridge, watching reports flood in from every sector. Cities were in chaos. Governments were collapsing. Loyalties were shifting. The truth had been exposed, but that didn't mean the fight was over. It meant the real war was just beginning. Shira stepped beside him, her glowing blue eyes reflecting the stars beyond. She had fought for years to uncover the truth about her people, but now that it was out, what came next? The Ghost Fleet awakens. A sharp beeping sound from the ship's console broke the moment. One of the rebellion's officers looked up, pale. "Captain Vance, you need to see this." Eric moved to the console. A distress signal flickered on the screen, one coming from the outermost reaches of human space. The words chilled him to the bone. Unauthorized military fleet DHTKT. Massive movement. Unknown orders. Shira leaned over, reading the transmission. What does it mean? Eric exhaled slowly. It means Devran wasn't the end of this. The Admiral had been powerful, yes, a monster in his own right. But Eric knew men like Devran didn't act alone. And if an unknown fleet was mobilizing, then someone else was pulling the strings. Someone worse. A traitor's warning. The transmission had a location embedded in its signal, a derelict station on the edge of known space. Eric made the call. Set course for the coordinates. Full speed. The ship's engines roared to life. Within hours, they arrived at a long-abandoned refueling station, drifting near the shattered remains of an old war zone. It was supposed to be empty. But as soon as they approached, an encrypted message came through. Eric frowned. It's coming from inside the station. The screen crackled, then a voice. One Eric had never expected to hear again. "Vance, I don't have much time. They're coming." Eric's heart slammed in his chest. "Commander Holt." Shira's brows furrowed. "Who is that?" Eric didn't answer immediately. Commander Holt had been his mentor. The man who had trained him, the one who had sent him on his first classified missions. But Holt had been reported dead years ago. So why was he sending messages now? The message repeated, more urgent. "If you're hearing this, Vance, then you need to run. The Ghost Fleet is awakening. The war Devran started was only the beginning. The real power behind it all is coming for you." Eric's pulse quickened. Shira tensed. It's a trap. Eric's jaw tightened. Or it's the only warning we're going to get. The transmission ended. The station remained silent. But Eric could feel it. Something was watching them. The deadliest fleet in history. Before he could react, the ship's alarms blared. Massive energy signatures detected. The scanner lit up. Dozens of ships suddenly appearing out of the void, decloaking all around them. Eric's blood ran cold. The ghost fleet was real. Old warships, human, alien, hybrid designs never seen before, emerged from the darkness. These weren't standard military forces. They were something else. Jaira grabbed the console. They were waiting for us. Eric clenched his fists. We need to get out of here. But before he could give the order, a transmission cut through their comms. A deep, cold voice. Not Deverin's. Someone else. Someone worse. Eric Vance. Eric froze. You thought you could stop us. The voice was familiar, but twisted, older. And then it hit him. Admiral Deverin had been powerful, but he had answered to someone. The real mastermind behind the war. The architect of it all. A man Eric had believed to be dead for years. Grand Marshal Kaler. The man who had ordered the war's beginning. The man who had sent Eric to fight it. No escape. The ghost fleet surrounded them, their weapons locking on. Eric's crew scrambled for control, but their ship was already caught in a gravity well. They weren't just being ambushed. They were being captured. Kaler's voice returned, calm, confident. You exposed the past, Captain, but that doesn't matter anymore. The war you fought in was nothing compared to what comes next. The largest warship in the fleet shifted in front of them, its massive cannons humming with power. You want to know the truth. Kaler's voice was almost amused. Come and see it for yourself. And then, their ship was pulled into the ghost fleet's flagship, disappearing into the abyss. Redemption and reunion. The darkness inside the ghost fleet's flagship was absolute. The corridors were lined with cold, lifeless metal, illuminated only by thin strips of pale blue light that flickered as Eric and Jaira were dragged through the ship. The enemy soldiers, ghostly, silent, their armor polished but without insignia, moved with precision. No unnecessary motion, no wasted energy. They were not mercenaries. They were something else. The restraints on Eric's wrists burned slightly, humming with an energy field that blocked his ability to move freely. No chance of escape. At least, not yet. Jaira walked beside him, her expression unreadable, but Eric could see the tension in her shoulders. She was waiting, calculating. They were both waiting for their moment. The man who started it all. The corridor opened into a massive command hall, lined with towering glass windows that overlooked the ghost fleet outside. Ships unlike anything Eric had ever seen hung in the void, silent, monstrous, predatory. And at the center of the room, standing before a massive holographic star chart, was Grand Marshal Kaler, the architect of the war. The man who had ordered Eric to fight. The man who had manipulated history itself. He turned as they entered, his deep-set eyes sharp and amused. His uniform, unlike Deverin's, was not pristine. It was practical, worn, the uniform of a man who had seen more battles than he could count. But his presence was suffocating. Kaler studied Eric with a slow, knowing smirk. It's been a long time, Captain. Eric clenched his jaw. Not long enough. Kaler chuckled. Still defiant, even when you've lost. He turned his gaze to Jaira. And the last princess of the Xilari. I always knew you'd be trouble. Jaira didn't flinch. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Kaler smiled as if he found that amusing. Oh, but where would be the fun in that? The true purpose of the war. Kaler gestured toward the massive holographic display in the center of the room. It showed a galaxy-wide map, but certain systems were marked in deep red. Eric frowned. He recognized those systems. War zones, abandoned colonies, places devastated by past conflicts. Shira narrowed her eyes. What is this? Kaler's smirk faded, replaced by something more serious. This is what comes next. He stepped forward, tapping the console. The display zoomed in, showing the hidden system in the outer reaches of space. A dark, pulsing mass flickered in the hologram. Not a planet, not a station, something else. Kaler turned to them. We never fought this war for control. We fought it to prepare. Eric's hands clenched into fists. Prepare for what? Kaler's expression darkened. For the real war. The hologram changed again, revealing distorted images, blurry but unmistakable. Massive alien ships, larger than anything in known space. They weren't Silari. They weren't human. Shira inhaled sharply. What? What are they? Kaler exhaled. A species older than both of us. A species that doesn't negotiate. That doesn't conquer. It consumes. And we have spent the last 50 years trying to hide from it. Eric's pulse pounded. He wasn't lying. Kaler turned back to them. Humanity didn't start this war because we wanted Silari resources. His gaze locked onto Eric's. We started it because we needed an army. A trained force ready to fight for survival when the real enemy comes. Silence. Eric's world tilted. The war had been a lie. But what if it had been a necessary one? A choice with no right answer. Kaler sighed. You hate me, Captain. I don't blame you. But ask yourself, would humanity have survived if we had waited? If we had spent years in peace, unprepared, and the real enemy arrived? Shira's voice was ice. You murdered my people. You destroyed entire civilizations. Kaler didn't flinch, and if I hadn't, the galaxy would have burned. Eric's thoughts raced. He had spent years believing he had fought for something. Then he had learned it was a lie. Now he was being told it had been a lie with a purpose. The final battle. Before Eric could speak, the ship shook violently. The alarms blared. A soldier rushed in, eyes wide. Sir, we have incoming. Unidentified fleet. Kaler turned sharply. On screen. A holographic display changed, and Eric's breath caught. Because the enemy was already here. The alien ships, massive, black, moving in eerie unison, had arrived. Kaler's expression remained unreadable. But Eric saw it, the first flicker of something he never thought he'd see in the Grand Marshal's eyes. Fear. The ship rocked again. Red warning lights flooded the room. An officer's voice rang out over the comms. Shields failing. They're breaching the hull. Kaler turned back to Eric and Shira, his expression grim. You wanted the truth. You're about to see it firsthand. The battle for survival. Everything erupted at once. The Ghost Fleet opened fire, their cannons unleashing hell. But the enemy ships barely flinched, absorbing the energy blasts like they were nothing. And then, they returned fire. Hull breaches, explosions, entire ships vanishing in flashes of dark energy. The Ghost Fleet was being slaughtered. Shira grabbed Eric's arm. We need to get out of here. But Eric wasn't looking at the destruction. He was looking at Kaler, the man who had destroyed so many lives. The man who had orchestrated war itself. And yet, the man who had been right all along. Kaler turned to Eric, his gaze sharp. You wanted to fight me, Captain. You still can. Or you can do something smarter. Eric exhaled. He didn't have time to think. They had one chance. He turned to Shira. We take the ship. Her eyes widened. What? Eric turned back to Kaler. You have the most advanced fleet in the galaxy, but you're fighting a battle you can't win. Kaler studied him for a long moment. Then, he smiled. Then let's change the rules. A new alliance. The enemy was tearing through the fleet, but Eric knew one thing. The only way to win a war like this was together. Human. Silari. Enemies turned allies. Kaler, Eric, and Shira would have to fight side by side. Because if they didn't, there would be nothing left to fight for.